all for joining us. After we will leave questions for the end. So while the presentation is going on, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A, and then we can ask them once the presentation is done. So it is a true pleasure to introduce Dr. Gollan, whose research I've been following since I was a graduate student. She's a cognitive and clinical neuropsychologist whose research specializes in the psycholinguistics of bilingualism, aging, and Alzheimer's disease. She's currently a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of California, San Diego, the co-director of the Latino core of the UCSD ADRC, as well as faculty in 2 joint doctoral programs between UCSD and San Diego State University. Her research has been funded continuously by various sources, NIH, NSF, and so on. And recently she developed a multilingual naming test, or the MINT, which I'm sure a lot of you have used, and focused on the cognitive mechanisms of language switching in bilinguals of different language combinations. Her earlier work investigated why bilinguals have more tip of the tongue states that monolinguals develop and she also developed the frequency lag. So she is herself a multilingual and is married to a bilingual with whom she raised 2 bilingual kids in San Diego. And as a fun fact, Dr. Gollan actually started her training at MGH with Dr. Janice Sherman. So welcome back to part of your family, I guess. And we're looking forward to your presentation. So you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, so let's see. There we go. Okay. Thank you for everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Ed-Marie, for organizing, and Yakil and Ed-Marie for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk mostly about intended language switches and a little bit about unintended language switches, which are rare, but we figured out how to induce language control errors in the lab. I'll tell you all about that. If you look in, do a literature search, you'll find over 100, almost 150 studies on language switching and how language switching is hard and induces processing costs. So I started out studying language switching, not believing that result and trying to debunk it. And it took me 10 years to figure out how to make them go away. I'm not going to actually talk about that today, but if you're interested, you can ask me about that at the end. One of the reasons why people like to study language switching so very much is because it's an ecologically valid way of studying switching. And you can also use it, easily study it in the lab in ways that are relatively ecologically valid compared to other forms of task switching, which is also heavily studied. So we're going to talk about language switching and how it changes in aging, and what this tells us about how executive control, and more specifically maybe inhibitory control, is used in language production in speech. So in the first part of the talk, which is going to be the bulk of the talk, I'm going to mostly talk about picture naming, various types, including untimed picture naming tests, like in the multilingual naming test, a study we did to look at voluntary switching, my first attempt to debunk, failed attempt. The nice thing about voluntary switching is you can look not only at how much time it takes people to switch, but you can look at things like how often do people choose to switch? And choosing to switch, it turns out, is also something that requires executive control. Should I stay or should I switch is the title of that paper. I'm going to talk about cued forced language switches, which are the much more common way of studying language switching, and link it all to inhibitory control. And then in the second part, I called it Bilinguals Out of Control. We use reading aloud, and in that, I'll show you how we get language errors, switching or actually not switching by mistake most of the time. And then something called the autocorrect task, which is a monolingual extension of this work that demonstrates how studying bilinguals can lead to broader implications just for understanding switching, aging, Alzheimer's disease, and language production more generally. Some of the questions we're going to answer: why do bilinguals switch? Should you let bilinguals use either language? Who is bilingual? Why should we study, and why should we study bilinguals? So let's start with this first one. So why do bilinguals switch? Well, sometimes they switch just to be funny. So like, what if soy milk is just regular milk introducing itself in Spanish? So those of you who know Spanish might have chuckled there. And what this kind of joke demonstrates is something that a lot of the research, early research on bilingualism established, that even when you're using one language, just one language, both languages are active and accessible, which is what makes something like this funny. But bilinguals switch for many different reasons. Something will trigger a switch, like a cat running into a dog, or you pick up the phone and it's somebody who doesn't speak the language you were just speaking. Sociolinguistic reasons, like switching to fit in, to get something. So when I get really angry, I switch to English, even though we speak Hebrew at home. Most of the swear words come out in English for some reason, to include or exclude someone. So like my kids know if I switch to English, I'm really, really angry. To say something that can't easily be said in another language. To express emotion or for emphasis. There's some recent really cool research. Oh, there we go. If you can't say anything nice, say it in Yiddish. Really cool research showing that if you speak in a non-dominant language, you might have less access to your emotions and make choices that are more rational and less emotional. Can also be used in therapy as a tool to either increase or decrease access to emotion. Lexical accessibility. So even if the word exists and you know it in both languages, for whatever reason, it might be more accessible in a different language than the one you just happen to be speaking. One thing that doesn't happen very often is bilingual switching by mistake, less than 1% of the time. So one of our early, about 10 years ago, we published this study that kind of answers this question: should you let bilinguals name pictures in either language? What you see here is something cool you can do with bilinguals. So this is just one picture naming test, but there's 4 different naming scores shown here. What happens if you give credit for pictures in either language? You give credit only for pictures that were named in the dominant language, only in the non-dominant language, or in both languages. So one picture naming test, 4 different naming scores for bilinguals. And these are 16 English dominant bilinguals from the UCSD Alzheimer's disease. This gives you a little bit more information about how old they were, how educated they were, and about how cognitively impaired. Most of you know the mini-mental, and this is their average dementia rating scale score, if you know that. This is this was done before we developed the MINT, so this was with the Boston naming test. And you see that letting bilinguals name pictures or give credit for pictures named in either language, they named slightly more pictures than they did just in the dominant language. Many fewer pictures in the non-dominant language. So testing bilinguals in a language that's not dominant is a mistake. And then fewer pictures still were they able to name in both languages. And so if your goal is to maximize fluency, let them name in either language. But what about if your goal is to tell if they have a naming impairment? Which naming score should you use? And so to answer that question, we compared these bilinguals to a group of matched English dominant, cognitively healthy, older controls. And you see some similar patterns, but the main thing, which I'll show you a summary of in a second, is what you want to do to distinguish patients from controls is compare across groups, right? And when you compare across groups, this difference, the either language score, turns out to be a little bit smaller than the dominant only score. And that's because the benefit of using either language in these bilinguals was larger for patients than it was for controls. When we looked at Spanish dominant participants, the results were similar, although the Spanish dominant participant, normal participants also benefited from the either language option a little bit more than these controls did. So this just summarizes the different scores. So this is this minus that, and the scale is changed so that you can appreciate the difference a little bit better. And you can see that it's the dominant language only score that gives you the biggest difference between patients and controls. That's the English dominant participants, and the same result for the Spanish dominant participants. We had about the same number. Okay, so test in the dominant language. What the either language benefit shows is that although bilinguals have one language that tends to be dominant, and this is true for most bilinguals, really balanced bilinguals are relatively rare, even bilinguals with one clearly dominant language will, for some words, be dominant in their other language, meaning sometimes the non-dominant language is stronger. So this is a form of reverse dominance. It's not the kind of reverse dominance that we've been making a big deal out of lately. And I don't think this has anything to do with inhibition, but it's interesting to notice that this business of language dominance shifting over time, shifting depending on what you were just doing. This is something that's really common in bilingualism in a number of different tasks and domains. Okay, so quick summary. Bilinguals switch languages for lots of different reasons, and this can increase naming scores. We're going to build this summary page. So going to the bottom, who is bilingual and what language should I use to test them? It depends. If you want to maximize naming ability, you allow both languages, but not if you want to distinguish patients from controls. So I need a guinea pig. I don't know if I can only see Yakil and Ed-Marie. Does one of you want to do, like turn on your, turn off your mute and get ready to name pictures?
Sure, I can do it.
Okay, so here we go. So just name pictures in whatever language comes to mind.
Hand. Árbol. Balloons. Book. Bobo. Lápiz. Bell. Martillo.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so when I first heard about language switches eliciting costs in time, I just didn't believe it. I said, well, that's because you're forcing people to name pictures in a particular language and they would never normally do that. And so we wanted to test this hypothesis. To do this, we had 3 blocks. Like the one that Ed-Marie just did was called the either language block, where we just told them to do just that. And then 2 other testing blocks where they could only name pictures in English or only name pictures in Spanish. And this was counterbalanced for order between participants. We had young and older bilinguals in this particular study. The older bilinguals had some lower education participants. And so this is a difference to keep in mind. In another study I'll show you in a minute, it's exactly the opposite. Everybody was exposed to Spanish first and learned English later in life. And then this shows you self-ratings of proficiency for English and for Spanish on a 1 to 7 scale, relatively highly proficient in both languages on average, and relatively balanced. But you'll notice something, because in addition to this, this was before we had the naming test, but at the end of the experiment, we asked participants to translate all of the words that they saw from one language to the other, and to have some objective measure. So like, for example, the older participants rate their ability in Spanish as lower than what the young participants did. But if you look at their ability to translate into Spanish, it's just as good. There was no significant difference. And this is why we've stopped relying on self-ratings, because they differ between bilinguals of different language combinations, bilinguals who are English dominant rate themselves differently from bilinguals who are Spanish dominant. And so we use objective measures. So the main question was, will voluntary switches be slower than non-switch responses? And if switching is hard, will older bilinguals switch less often than young bilinguals? So the first thing is, old and young bilinguals switched at about the same rate in this study. If anything, the older bilinguals switched slightly more often. But what did predict switching behavior is how balanced you were in your knowledge of the two languages. And so this shows you reaction time, so the difference between your two languages. So these people named pictures a second slower in one language than the other. And these people had similar naming times in the two languages in those blocks where they were not allowed to switch languages. And then on the y-axis, it just shows you the proportion of time that trials that people decided to switch. And so here we have quote unquote bad bilinguals. These are bilinguals who are not balanced. And I put that in quotes because it's silly. It's just bilinguals vary in how balanced they are. These are not bad bilinguals. They just are relatively more dominant in one language than the other. These are the perfect bilinguals. The perfect bilinguals switch more often. And this is equally true for young and for older bilinguals. So this brings me to one answer to the who is bilingual, because this is a continuum, right? We have everybody here is bilingual to different degrees. And so there's probably no such thing as a monolingual either. We get asked this question when we compare bilinguals to monolinguals. How do you define monolingual? Is it difficult? Just as hard to answer as how do you define bilingual. And so when thinking about bilingualism, we want to embrace this continuum and measure it with objective measures. And then we have really powerful variables to work with in our research. So there's the little addition to our who is bilingual. Now, this business of balanced bilinguals switching more often was pretty exciting to see and reminded me of one of my favorite studies in the literature done by a linguist. She looked at spontaneous conversations and interviews between Puerto Ricans living in New York City and found basically that. So this is from her abstract. While bilinguals tended to switch at various syntactic boundaries within the sentence, the fluent bilinguals did that. The less fluent bilinguals favored switching between sentences, allowing them to participate in the code switching mode without fear of violating a grammatical rule of either of the languages involved. And so while this doesn't focus on the rate of switching, it focuses on different types of switches. And so certain types of switches are more common in balanced bilinguals. Switching is not evidence of disability or disadvantage. Sophisticated switching is something that really proficient bilinguals do, and it's rule governed, and you can study it in interesting ways. Okay. Now, another thing though is that, okay, balanced bilinguals switch more, but another thing we found in this study is that all bilinguals switch more after you turn their Spanish on. These are bilinguals in San Diego. English is the dominant language. But this shows you the older bilinguals, the English dominant bilinguals, and a smaller group that we had of balanced young, these are the young participants. If they did the either language block first, they chose to switch less often, and this was true for everybody, than if they did the either language block after they had named a whole block of pictures only in Spanish, and then everybody switched more often, more like the balanced bilinguals. But my attempt to debunk didn't work, or this first attempt at least didn't work. Voluntary switching was costly. This shows you just the young English dominant bilinguals. This is that either language block on a trial where they switched. And time in milliseconds. And these are small but highly robust switch costs in time. Repeating the same language that you used on the previous trial, you're a little bit faster than the language you used if you switched. And another really striking thing about this figure was a sort of a turning point for me when I saw this pattern of data, because in the single language blocks, these bilinguals who I've told you are English dominant name pictures faster in English than they do in Spanish. But in the mixed language block, this reverses. This reversed language dominance effect is something that at first I didn't believe when I saw it, but it's something that we think is a signature of inhibitory control that bilinguals employ when they know they're going to have to switch languages a lot. So reverse language dominance. There's my colleague and his baby, Vic Ferreira. So reverse dominance, huh? Really? So for those of you who are not bilingual, if there are any such people in the talk, just to give you a sense of just to appreciate what this means. An analogy might be like being stronger, temporarily stronger in your weaker arm. And note here that even being equally strong in both of your arms is kind of amazing. You could even make the argument that it would be more like writing better with your non-dominant hand. And then I started thinking about all these other different analogies, which I'm not sure if they apply, if they're right or not. Preferring to sing alto when you're actually a soprano, turning a night owl into a morning person, preferring a backhand over a forehand in tennis. But one thing that I've become pretty convinced of is that reverse dominance in these mixed naming blocks is a signature of inhibition of the dominant language. And I'm not the only one to report this. I want to show you the kind of paradigm that elicits these kinds of effects. And now I need another guinea pig, and I don't want to pick on Ed Marie again. Can we get another volunteer bilingual to name some pictures?
I can go.
Awesome. Okay. Oopsie. Okay, get ready. So this is harder. So when you see a blue square around the picture, you have to name the picture in English.
Okay.
And when you see a red square around the picture, you have to name it in some other language, whatever language. Usually we give people practice with the colors, and we're just tossing you straight into the fire. So.
Hand. Árbol. Libro. Hand. Bell. Book. Mano. Campana. Pencil.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so here is, I'm going to show you all kinds of examples of reverse dominance that you can find in the literature. So this is Spanish, Catalan bilinguals. Spanish is the first and more dominant language, but naming times are slower in Spanish. Here we have the pattern with German, Dutch bilinguals. Same thing, slower naming times in the dominant language. Here we have Dutch English bilinguals, and it looks like it's backwards. That's because the x-axis is obscured. These guys, for some reason, chose to plot the switch trials on the left and the non-switch trials on the right. German English, this more recent study, looked at, they had 2 different cues for each language. You can imagine how hard that would be. And there's some cue switching costs. Language switch costs are bigger, but here again, the dominant language is slower. And then this study, they don't actually report this analysis this way, but it sure looks pretty prominent. Look how big, they actually had single language blocks the way we did too. And you can see dominance reversing in the mixed language block for Finnish English bilinguals. So these data seem to support the inhibitory control model. which is one of the most widely cited processing models in research on bilingualism. The hypothesis is that to speak in the non-dominant language, bilinguals inhibit the dominant language as a whole, and this is an effortful and controlled process. There's also competition between translation equivalent lexical representations, which is resolved through reactive inhibition and is a relatively more automatic process. Okay, so adding to our summary. Balanced bilinguals switch more often, but unbalanced bilinguals switch more too in some contexts, but switches are not cost-free. And I want to show you this recent replication that I think provides more convincing evidence for the idea that it's really inhibition of the dominant language. Ooh, I see a question. How do you determine how balanced a bilingual is? That's a good question. There's lots of different ways to do that. We're going to take a look at that a little bit more, and then we can talk about it more at the end. So in this study, this was done by Dan Kleinman, who was a postdoc in the lab at the time. He took the cued switching condition from a number of different studies we ran in the lab over the years. So we had 416 bilinguals and over 100,000 picture naming trials. And again, there were 2 or 3 testing blocks, 2 single language, actually this should be 3 or 4, English only, Spanish only, and a cued switching block. And then some of them also had a voluntary switching block or other types of switching blocks. And these were order counterbalanced again. This shows you the results from the single language blocks. The dominant language, you'll notice in a lot of these figures, is often darker to represent the fact that it's dominant. And in single language blocks, over the course of the block, so this is the beginning to the middle and the end of the block, you see the dominant language is faster and naming times get faster with repetition, which is what you would expect to see. With repetition, response times should be faster. But here's the mixed language blocks. First of all, it's really noticeable how much slower bilinguals are in the mixed blocks, and striking that they don't get faster over time. In fact, the dominant language gets slower over time, really kind of screaming something is that it's being inhibited in some way. More recently, my graduate student recently got her PhD with this as part of her project. She asked, because in that earlier study that I showed you with voluntary switching, older bilinguals did show reversed language dominance, but she wanted to know, will older bilinguals be able to reverse dominance in a cued switching paradigm? And we brought Dan Kleinman along to make the study run as smoothly as it could, and to keep in mind the study that just showed you, to kind of do it in a similar way. Now here's to address the how do you tell if bilinguals are balanced question. This is my more favorite way right now to do this. We developed this naming test for the purpose of measuring bilingual language proficiency. These are the pictures. I'm happy to send them to anybody who wants them. And the test works in English, Spanish, Mandarin, and Hebrew. So you can test lots of different kinds of bilinguals with just this one test. The way we like to do it now, and actually we're working on a speeded version of it that we're calling the MINT Sprint. You test bilinguals first in their dominant language and then in their non-dominant language, and then you take a ratio. And you can get an estimate of how bilingual they are. We validated this test against oral proficiency interviews, which of course provide a much more rich idea of what type of bilingual a person is. And all of these things could be debated, how to define bilinguals, how to measure it, and it's an important thing. So in this study, we had more young bilinguals than older bilinguals. And in this case, we tried harder to recruit English dominant bilinguals and to avoid participants with lower education levels. And what we ended up with was actually the older participants are more educated than the young, because most of them finished college and these guys are still in college. But you can see the same sort of pattern as what we saw before. The older bilinguals have slightly lower, give themselves lower scores on our rating scale. There's our 7-point rating scale defined for you. But then in this study, they actually named significantly more pictures than the young bilinguals in both languages. So don't rely on self-ratings. If you can avoid it, don't rely on self-ratings. So we had a handful, maybe 3 or 4, I think, Spanish dominant bilinguals in both groups. And so showing this by dominance instead of by language, it looks pretty similar. Here we have the dominant language in dark blue and the non-dominant language in tchelet, which is the Hebrew word for light blue. And then to get these bilingual index scores, how bilingual are you? We just divide the non-dominant by the dominant score, the picture naming test scores. So the older bilinguals were about 81% bilingual on average. And there's some, I see another, oh, it's the same question. Okay. These are the data. So the young bilinguals, first of all, everybody names pictures faster in the dominant language than in the non-dominant language in the single language blocks. But then the young bilinguals showed significantly reversed language dominance and the older bilinguals did not. So we just stare at that for a second. So you could, this might be evidence of an inhibitory control deficit, and that is the story that we're telling. There are other interpretations of this data pattern though, and if you want to know about that, you can ask me later. We also wanted to try to start understanding, where is this inhibition being applied? Is this something to repetition, like we saw it seem to be increasing with repetition in the mixed language block in that study that Dan did with the hundreds of bilinguals, or is it applied at the whole language level, or could it be both? To get at this question, we had 2 sets of pictures, and bilinguals first switched languages with 1 set of pictures for 2 mixed blocks, and then they did 2 more mixed blocks where we introduced a new set of pictures and intermixed them all together. And we hypothesized, if it's a whole language effect, we should see inhibition transferring immediately to the new set of pictures. If it's something very specific to the set repeating over and over, we should see bigger inhibition for the set that they saw initially than for the new set of pictures. And which set of pictures was shown first was counterbalanced between subjects. This just shows you the design. 4 naming blocks, 2 with just 1 set of pictures, and then 2 more with them intermixed. And then this is the data. So we have young bilinguals on the left, older on the right. This is the first list and the second list that was introduced halfway. Really big inhibition for that new list. So this wasn't something we anticipated ahead of time, and it's actually really robust. Significant interaction between age group and language dominance. So only the young bilinguals showed this transfer of inhibition to the new list. And within young bilinguals, dominance reversal was bigger for that new list, suggesting that maybe in this study, even something about repetition was undoing some of the inhibition, kind of opposite what we saw a couple of years ago. So how do we explain this? We hypothesized that bilinguals inhibit the entire language, maybe through something like language nodes that are connected to the entire lexicon and can take intention to reduce access or slow down, prevent automatic responding in the language that's more dominant. So reverse dominance we take as evidence of inhibition at the whole language level. This has been replicated in many different types of bilinguals, and we see it even in voluntary switching. And as for aging effects, older bilinguals switch languages as often as young bilinguals, but older bilinguals can't, or maybe they just don't, reverse dominance in cued picture naming tasks. Okay, so I don't have a huge amount of time, but we do have a little bit of time to talk about bilinguals out of control. Are there any burning questions?
We have 2 questions, but you can decide whether you want to answer them or maybe leave them for the end.
Okay. Is that from the Q&A?
From the chat. Would you like to answer them now?
Let's see.
So I can read them to you. So Dr. Sherman asks, did the older bilinguals continue to use both languages throughout their life? Might their self-ratings, which are lower than for younger individuals, reflect that they perceive a change in their abilities?
Yeah, so the older bilingual, we didn't look, so we have information about a lifelong use in terms of how much they used the language when they were kids and then how much they're currently using the 2 languages. And the older bilinguals tend to be using both languages a little bit more. But I think you're right that when people rate themselves, it's all about who they're comparing themselves to. And the older participants are maybe focusing on how their language abilities are now relative to years ago. I'm not really sure what they're focusing on though, because they have larger vocabularies, and it could just be that they have higher standards of excellence. So we don't know. And then it says,
Selena,
yeah.
I am curious to know, more of a general question, are there differences in switching between non-balanced bilinguals who learned their second language in childhood versus in adulthood?
I'm sure it's hard to do justice to this question. There are probably so many different ways of answering it, but one thing we know about bilingual kids is that either language benefit is really big in kids. It takes a while to acquire all the words in both of the languages. And so Ellen Bialystok has some work showing, for example, that if you divide the Boston naming test into pictures of things that might be learned at home, the heritage language speakers will tend to know those in the home spoken language, but not in English. And it takes a while to catch up. And so they might switch for reasons that have to do with lexical accessibility relatively more than older bilinguals who've had a longer amount of time to learn everything in both languages. And yeah. So thank you for these questions. Should I carry on, Ed-Marie?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So how do we get bilinguals to have a little bit less control? So for years, we tried using the verbal fluency task, and language intrusions are rare, but one way we can induce them consistently is by asking bilinguals to read aloud. And I'm going to show you how this works. So we give them paragraphs like this, where it's written mostly in one language, but then some of the time there's a switch to the other language. And I don't know if people can hear. Let's see. I turn the volume all the way up. Tell me, Ed-Marie, if you can hear, will you nod your head as this starts? Okay. Watch carefully when they get here, you'll hear that she says when instead of cuando. We're calling this a between language intrusion error. When is the English equivalent of cuando. And then it might happen here too. And then here there's a within language error. She skips at and then goes back and self-corrects. Okay, so Ed-Marie, get ready.
Suddenly, I heard that Alien opened the door to the kitchen. Timmy and I kept really quiet and pretended as if we hadn't heard anything. It wasn't long before we heard the scratching start up once again. Timmy stayed silent in nuestra bedroom while I sneak out through the kitchen without Mom seeing me. I turned the first corner in the dark, and then I held up the second corner. I carefully took a peek at the window when I heard it scratching all over it again. Very slowly, I began to see a bit better thanks to the light from the oil lamp in the kitchen. What I saw made me laugh, and at the same time, I didn't know what to do. The boogeyman was Dad.
Okay. Okay, so in this reading aloud task, people rarely, but sometimes produce errors. And this shows you the proportion of errors within language errors, like skipping at and then going back and filling it in, is something that bilinguals tend to do more in the language that's less dominant when they're reading a paragraph and they have to produce words in their non-dominant language. But for intrusion errors, like saying when instead of cuando, filling it in to avoid switching, they're much more likely to do that when they're reading a paragraph that's written mostly in the non-dominant language and they come upon a dominant language switch word. This is my colleague, Matt Goldrick. We looked at this with young and older bilinguals. This shows you just the same data that you just saw. The younger bilinguals with reverse dominance for intrusions and normal dominance for within language errors. And then this shows you what the older bilinguals look like. They produce more errors than younger bilinguals overall, but their dominance effects look exactly the same. So here we do see reverse dominance in older bilinguals. And this could mean a lot of different things. It could mean that this is not evidence of inhibition, that this is something else going on in this task, or it could mean that with contextual support, older bilinguals are able to reverse. We get this pattern even in bilinguals with Alzheimer's disease. So this shows you, the switch rates look much higher because this is the proportion of time that they switch, the percent of time that they switch only on words that are switch out words, the words that I'd highlighted in red. But you see that both the bilinguals with Alzheimer's disease and the controls exhibit this reverse language dominance effect. Okay, so we get reverse language dominance in reading aloud of mixed paragraphs too. And bilinguals rarely switch languages by mistake, but these switches do increase somewhat in aging and with Alzheimer's disease. And then we see intact dominance reversal for older bilinguals in the read aloud task. Okay, the last part of the talk. So one time when I presented these data, somebody came up to me and said, hey, can you do this with monolinguals? And my initial reaction was, were you paying attention? This is about bilinguals, you know? And then I slept on it and realized, well, this is actually kind of clever. Why not? There must be ways of inducing speech errors with reading aloud in monolinguals. And we tried to do this. I don't know if I can get one more guinea pig. Can I get one more guinea pig? I like guinea pigs. It's going to be reading in English.
I can do it.
Okay.
Just go?
Yep.
Every day in the early morning hours, the sunlight would barge through the window curtain, waking Doug up. He opened his eyes and decided he might as well get out of bed. Usually he would cover his head with the covers and sleep in longer, but today he wandered to try sometime new. After whacking the alarm a couple of times, he forced himself to get up and immediately began doing jumping jacks. He wanted to do 100, but found that he couldn't quite get there on his first attempt. He stooped just shy of his goal at 80 and then took several seconds to catch his breath. Next on his agenda were push-ups. He thought of his uncle who had been in the army. He would have approved of their sudden change in his usually lazy nephew. Doug made it though his list of fitness gals and started to plan his next challenge, breakfast. The usual fare included bacon and buttered toast with jam. Today he planned to eat oats, wet banana slices. This wasn't going to be easy, but Doug felt great, even confident. Each day was a little easier than the one before.
Awesome, thank you. This shows you all the trick words in this paragraph. I think you made an error here and maybe here. You said the and his. Amazingly though, this should be highlighted in red because this should be through, not though. And this was, I think, our most error-prone target in this paragraph, and you managed to get this one right. So this is something we're calling the autocorrect task because these words, the highlighted in red, and also this one, are nonsensical in the paragraph, and people, when they're reading, start to get into the paragraph's meaning and fill in to avoid producing these nonsensical malapropisms in the middle of a paragraph. In this study that we just, it's just out in Psych and Aging, we found that although all people when reading make these errors, older people do this more often. And we also had some biomarker data for these participants. And if you were positive for the biomarker, you were more likely to produce errors. And if you had both, if you were older and positive for the biomarker, you were particularly less likely, this shows now correct responses, to read those nonsensical words correctly, more likely to autocorrect. And so this monolingual extension demonstrates how we can use reading aloud to study speech production, even in monolingual participants, and the role that executive control might have in preventing speech errors. A kind of monitoring heavy task is reading aloud paragraphs like that. Some open questions. So why do bilinguals reverse dominance? We think this is probably a one-size-fits-all approach that overshoots. And when you think about it that way, and we have some evidence that dominance reversal doesn't actually make you more efficient in those mixed task blocks, if you view it that way, the older bilinguals' failure to do that might actually be a kind of older is wiser effect. And then it's not the same thing causing dominance reversal in all of these tasks. We started out with the either language naming benefit. There are many differences between reading aloud and picture naming, but I do still think that some form of executive control is probably involved in both of these, and that's what we're trying to figure out right now. For future research, I'm trying to think of analogies like the writing with your non-dominant hand analogy, and it might be helpful also to think about what inhibition is not. And so I'm pretty sure that inhibition is not just doing something backwards. One thing that might be similar though is trying to hide an accent. So everybody stay wicked fa pat until we get that vaccine rolled out. And thank you to all my collaborators.
Thank you so much. That was a really great presentation. So we actually have a question and I believe a comment. And so Dr. Sherman again says, hi, Tammy, sorry. Does it matter? Oh, do you want to ask the question, Janet?
Hi, Janet. Oh my God, hi.
If you want, go ahead and ask the question, yeah.
Hi, Tommy. Sorry about that. Hi, it's great to see you.
It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Tommy was, I think, our very first, or one of our very first psychometricians. Yeah, and wonderful friend. So it's great to see you. I have to remember what the question was now. So I'm going to go to the chat myself. Okay. So I was wondering in the reading task, the one that you showed with the different language words inserted, if it mattered what, in terms of their errors, if it mattered if these were like grammatical words, function words that they tended to switch or not switch, if they were more prone to make them on, like, you know, grammatical function words.
Yeah, so the vast majority of corrections happen with function word switches, and those single function word switches, it's really striking. They are, they don't want to be forced to produce them. And it's also the case that in spontaneous speech, although intrusions are rare, language intrusions are rare, they're overwhelmingly do involve function word switches. And so we've argued that what this probably represents is a switch that happens at the whole language level. So you switch on a function word because most of the words that we produce are function words. And so most of the time you just you make a language switch, it happens to be a function word. And those are hard to monitor. It's really hard. They're short, they come out really odd, they're ballistic, right? By the time they get to producing the function word, they stop themselves and correct and go back to producing speech in the intended language. But it's, yeah. Another kind of way that we can get lots of errors, and this happens even with Chinese English bilinguals reading paragraphs, is that they fail to switch on words that are similar in the two languages. So my understanding is that the Chinese word for hamburger is basically hamburger, and chocolate is something like chocolat or something. It's like, and those words also induce lots of errors, and it's probably a monitoring thing again.
Yeah, so I wonder if the fact that they are making the errors on the grammatical parts of speech might actually say something about your hypothesis around inhibition, because the syntax is such a kind of central and integral and in many ways kind of like automatic kind of processing, where you can't predict what words semantically, which content words you were going to insert that were going to be correct or were going to be incorrect. And then my comment was, I thought it was interesting that the older biomarker positive adults auto-corrected more than the healthy older adults or the younger individuals, because that suggests that their semantic processing to autocorrect to the correct semantics suggests that their semantic processing was intact. Mm-hmm. Right. So if you think about it, I think you're thinking about it from the executive kind of control standpoint, that they're less good at that. But if you think about it from, the standpoint of early on in Alzheimer's disease, semantic processing is impacted, then it's interesting that they're making those corrections. And I wonder if they were followed longitudinally, if they would start making less of those corrections.
Yeah, I would expect that they would, but it might take a really long time before they get to that point. These participants were all cognitively intact, squeaky clean, highly scrutinized and tested participants at the Alzheimer's Center. So we're sure that they didn't actually have Alzheimer's disease. They just are at risk based on the levels of A beta 42 in their blood and being low. What's and it could even be like it's possible that older people are predicting more because they've accumulated more experience and are better at predicting. So having the biomarker data was really important in that study for demonstrating that, yeah, it probably is a loss of executive function at some monitoring deficit somewhere. Yeah. Without that, it might have been, again, it could have been one of those, oh, maybe this is an advantage of aging.
Yeah, it could be an interesting task for following these people over time.
Yeah.
As they start to show other cognitive deficits, would the pattern switch? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good point. Does any of the other panelists have any questions?
I wish I could see everybody. There's 30 people, but I can't see them all. Funny.
Yes. Well, go ahead.
I actually have a question, but I don't know how relevant it is to the work that you've done, but I was thinking actually of individuals that speak more than 2 languages. And at what point it's actually a cost in terms, if it's almost too much, in terms of inhibition and executive function benefits.
Yeah, so this is one of the questions I get most often when I talk about bilingual disadvantages is that people, bilinguals name pictures about 60 milliseconds more slowly. They tend to have slightly lower verbal fluency scores, can name slightly fewer pictures on picture naming tests, even in their dominant language. And then I get asked this question, well, if you're multilingual, you should basically be aphasic, right? Because there's so many languages and you can't control them. And I mean, clearly that's not true. And we don't fully understand how this works. I can tell you from experience, it is hard to maintain several different languages. And usually people who speak multiple languages very fluently are either specially trained in some way or have unusual language abilities, and it's not random, right? So like my mother spoke 10 languages, and yeah, and part of it was the history, running away from the Nazis in Eastern Europe during World War II is what caused that to happen. But also she was very good with languages. And so there's a self-selection problem when you start to study multilinguals.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Gollan. This was really outstanding. We're so happy that you were able to share your research with all of us. And so thank you all for being here. We'll see you next year for our next speaker. So I hope you all have great holidays and have a good weekend. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
See you later, Tommy.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to see you.